Dell Comics began business in 1929 with the publication of the first issue of the Funnies, considered by many to be the first true comic book. And although Dell did publish stories featuring original characters, their primary focus was on licensed material. They would publish comics featuring characters from animated cartoons produced by Disney, Warner Brothers, and other studios. They reprinted newspaper comic strips in comic book form. They did adaptations of radio shows or stories featuring popular characters from the movies. Eventually, when television became a thing, they did adaptations of television shows. Now, in 1939, Dell began publishing an anthology book titled Four Color, the title based on the fact that color printers used four colors of ink: red, yellow, blue, and black. It was, as I said, an anthology title, with most issues featuring comic strip reprints, although it did include a few issues featuring stories taken from other sources, most notably an adaptation of the Disney movie Dumbo. The series was canceled after 25 issues, with the last issue reaching newsstands early in 1942. Now, a new four-color series began almost immediately. In fact, the first issue of the second volume of Four Color was out before the first series had actually ended. They overlapped a little. Now, this was also an anthology book, with the first issue reprinting a newspaper comic strip titled Little Joe. The series would last until 1962, with multiple issues being published each month throughout most of its run. Its last issue was number 1354, featuring Calvin and the Colonel, characters adapted from a then-current animated television show. Now, Four Color did inexplicably skip a few issue numbers during its run, but even taking that into account, there were over 1,300 original issues produced, making it, in terms of the number of issues published, the longest-running comic book in the history of the medium. Now, most of the early issues consisted of reprinted newspaper comic strips, although keep in mind that this would have been the first time many young readers would have seen these particular story arcs, many of which had first appeared in the newspapers 2 to 6 years earlier, so it was essentially new material for them. The popular dolls Raggedy Ann and Andy hosted the 5th issue. Now, the 9th issue featured Donald Duck, whose theatrical cartoons were extremely popular at the time. The cover story, Donald Duck Finds Pirate Gold, was original, with the plot adapted from an idea for a Disney cartoon that was never actually made. And it's an important issue, as it features the first comic book work of Carl Barks, who would go on to be the most popular writer and artist of Donald Duck Comics, and it is commonly acknowledged that Barks is one of the most brilliant creative minds in the medium's history. Four Color served as a testing ground for both licensed and original characters, a way to see if specific characters could generate enough sales to justify giving them their own titles. Comic book historian Alan Hutchinson, in an article titled The Four Color Graduates, found over 100 examples in which characters or television show adaptations that had one or more appearances in Four Color spun off into their own series. Now, in the days before comic book collecting was considered an investment and people simply enjoyed the stories being told for their own sake, there was no artificially created market for first issues. So when a character spun off into his own book, Dell would often count the Four Color appearances as part of the comic's sequential numbering. For instance, cowboy movie star Rex Allen appeared in Four Color number 316 in 1951. So when he got his own title later that year, the first issue was counted as number 2. Tom Corbett, a character from an early television science fiction show, appeared in 3 Four-Color issues, so his own series began with issue number 4. Now let's look at a few of the most significant Four-Color spin-offs. The single most important would undoubtedly be Scrooge McDuck. Donald Duck's rich but stingy uncle first appeared as a supporting character in Four Color 178 in 1947 in a story written and drawn by Carl Barks. Though Scrooge was initially meant to be a one-shot character, Barks began using him in later Donald Duck stories, dubbing him the richest duck in the world and gradually fleshing out his character as greedy but honest and hardworking. Scrooge became the main character in 3 Four-Color issues published in 1952 and 1953. These included the stories Only a Poor Old Man and Back to the Klondike, which added depth and likability to Scrooge's personality. So the first issue of his own comic, numbered issue number 4, because it took his Four-Color appearances into account, appeared in late 1953. With Carl Barks regularly contributing expertly told stories, Scrooge McDuck became the most popular and best-selling comic book character in the 1950s. Another success story is Little Lulu. Lulu was a comic strip character created by Marjorie Buell in 1935, with the precocious and tough little girl first appearing in single-panel cartoons published in the Saturday Evening Post. Her first 10 comic book appearances were in Dell's 4-color. Lulu then spun off into her own book, which ran for over 200 issues. These comic books were usually written by John Stanley, who found humor both in sincerely funny slapstick and in a firm understanding of how children and adults often perceive reality differently and have different priorities. The series is also an example of how Dell was inconsistent in how it numbered its comics. In Little Lulu's case, despite multiple 4-color issues, her own book began with issue number 1. The Lone Ranger was a protagonist in a long-running and extremely popular radio show. Later, he found equal success on television. His 7 4-color appearances began in 1945, and he spun off into his own series in 1948. This series ran 145 issues, eventually featuring striking and evocative painted covers. The Ranger's popularity spilled over into his supporting characters. Tonto starred in 4-color 312 in 1951. And then he spun off into his own series for a 33 issue. The Lone Ranger's horse Silver appeared in 2 4-color issues, and then galloped off into his own series, which also ran for 33 issues. Perhaps the most gleefully geeky idea ever spawned in comics arrived in 1955. 4-color number 595 introduced us to Turok, Son of Stone, a pre-Columbian Indian who, along with a friend, became trapped in a valley in which dinosaurs still existed. One more 4-color appearance, and 123 issues of Turok's own comic book followed. The Turok stories, graced with wonderful painted covers, are among the most purely entertaining comic book adventures ever produced. Now, not all characters who tried out in 4-color moved on. For instance, Captain Davy Jones, an early American sea captain, was introduced in 1954 in 4-color 598. But despite appearing in a well-illustrated and well-constructed adventure story, poor Captain Jones was never seen again. In addition to testing new characters, Dell was sometimes where established characters went after their own book was canceled. The comic strip character Crazy Cat had 5 4-color appearances after her own book ended. Fairy Tale Parade had a 9-issue run during the early 1940s, but later returned for sporadic visits to 4-color. Santa Claus Funnies had 2 issues published a year apart at Christmas time in 1942 and 1943. The editors at Dell then realized that it made more sense to simply drop Santa into a 4-color issue every holiday season. Now, for 20 years, Dell's 4-color gave comic book fans both humor and adventure. They took young readers to outer space, to the jungles of Africa and India, to the Old West, to Camelot, to deep under the ocean, and to hundreds of other places, both real and imaginary. Through 4-color, children were able to hunt for hidden treasure. They would battle pirates, they would explore alien planets, and they would fight monsters. It was a comic book that left a legacy of sincere and unpretentious storytelling that inspired the imagination. The library's collection of books that contain stories first published in 4-color include multiple volumes reprinting the works of Carl Barks, Turok, Son of Stone, Volume 1, and the Roy Rogers Archives. All are available to be checked out. Funny Books, A History of Dell Comics by Michael Barrier, is also available and it's highly recommended. We would also like to thank Alan Hutchinson for sending us a copy of his article, 4-Color Graduates, from which most of the information in this video was taken.